All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Ecology. Today, we are going to be finishing up the Intro to Communities, Chapter 16, and starting up Chapter 17, that's all about community dynamics, changes in communities over time. Yeah, if you have any questions before we start, you can ask them in the chat, and I can do my best to answer them. But otherwise, we'll go ahead and get started. Alrighty, I don't see anything popping up. Let me just make sure again that I am recording. Yes, okay. So here we go. Oh wait, there might be a chat question. When will exam 2 grades be posted? Whoops, I forgot to do that. Yeah, so everyone has taken exam 2 now at this point, and so yeah, I can post the grades. I'll do that basically as soon as I'm done with this presentation. Thanks for reminding me. Okay, and yeah, I'll post a key to that exam as well. All right, so let's finish up talking about Intro to Communities, this chapter 16. All right, we ended last time talking about the idea of community assembly and whether communities assemble as kind of a co-evolved superorganism where you tend to see lots of species kind of co-occurring together, you know, more than you would expect if everything was reacting randomly to the environment or independently to the environment. Or are all these species kind of just independently assembled in the environment based on their tolerances to abiotic conditions and that kind of thing, and so you get more communities that are just kind of grading into one another. And yeah, this was the idea of Clements and Gleason, these two famous ecologists. And yeah, we concluded that there's likely a mixture of both ideas going on in real communities. So we can think about Gleason's idea. Gleason was arguing that individual species are kind of independently distributed, and communities are just kind of a collection of individual species that happen to be overlapping in their distributions. And you can think of that as being sort of like the fundamental niche. So variation, individual variation and optima generate independent distributions for each species, and so that's what Gleason was arguing. However, there are some components of Clement's ideas going on as well, specifically with the realized niche. So the realized niche, again, is the final distribution of a species once you take into account species interactions. So Clements was really focused on that aspect of species distributions. And so yeah, you have forces like competition sort of restricting where species can occur, separating them, making them not occur together if they're going to outcompete each other. And then you can have also facilitation. This is more like the coevolution of partners in things like predator-prey interactions and mutualisms and that kind of thing, which keep species together and cause these kind of co-evolved superorganism type distributions where you get ecotones, where you get one type of community and then another type of community with not a lot of overlap in between them. So yeah, both ideas are likely important in structuring communities and the assembly and development of communities. Okay, so yeah, just to finish up talking about communities, we've actually already talked about a lot of the concepts in chapter 16, just from the way that I organized the course versus differed from the way that the book organized the course. And so yeah, some of the things that are covered in chapter 16 that we've already talked about include ideas about food webs, trophic cascades, direct and indirect interactions. And just to throw this reminder slide up here, this is showing indirect effects of fish on pollination of plants, a really cool study by Tiffany Knight et al. It's showing how these fish in ponds that have fish, they indirectly benefit plants, flowering plants around those ponds by reducing the abundance of dragonflies and therefore reducing the predators of the pollinators of the plants. So yeah, you can have these really crazy interaction webs, and we've already kind of covered some of those ideas. Since we covered those ideas, though, we have been talking a lot more about species interactions, especially using modeling, like pairwise interactions. How does a predator affect prey? How does a disease affect a host? How do two competitors affect each other? And you can extend those kinds of studies to looking at entire networks of interactions. So trying to figure out which species in a community are actually interacting with each other, how are they interacting with each other, and you can do models. It's really hard. It becomes like there's tons of parameters in the models. It's really mathematically complex. But some people are attempting to elucidate all of the interactions that are happening in food webs and in communities. Here's just some figures showing this is like interaction strengths where all of these different numbers in the circles are different species. And yeah, they're positively and negatively affecting each other with these different arrows. And yeah, whenever you do this, it's always really complicated for communities. Even simple communities that don't have that many species, the links between them can be very, very numerous. One cool thing that has come out of this this work, looking at looking at interaction networks instead of just pairwise interactions, is that sometimes the conclusions that we got with the pairwise interactions are sort of modified when we include more complex sets of interactions that involve more than just two species. Here's some examples with competitive networks. So in the Lotka-Volterra competition model, we were looking at how two competitors affect each other. And we saw fairly complex dynamics even with just two species. You could get either species winning, you could get the alternative stable states, and you could get stable coexistence. All of those predictions can change if you include more than two species competing with each other. So here's two examples. One, a competitive network that has kind of a rock, paper, scissors dynamics, where in this case, A beats B, B beats C, but C beats A, and so you can get these kinds of competitive networks where no species really has the advantage. There's always going to be a situation where one species loses, and a situation where it might win. But yeah, that's another force that is kind of missing from the Lotka-Volterra model that can contribute to species coexistence. So maybe species can coexist with each other because even if a species is competitively dominant to another pairwise species, it's not necessarily going to be dominant in an entire community for these kinds of rock, paper, scissors kinds of competitive interactions. Another name for that is intransitive competition, when you've got one species. There's never like a winner. There's always you're always going to lose against one of your opponents. So that's intransitive competition. Here's another example of a competitive network. In this case, there is a winner and a loser, but it occurs in a hierarchy. So A beats B and B beats C. But yeah, just two different ways that competition might change if you're including more than two competitors in the model. And you might be asking, does that kind of intransitive rock, paper, scissors competition really exist in nature? There is some good evidence that it does. There's a famous example with morphs of a single species of lizard, and like why you see genetic diversity being maintained. Here's an example of why you see species diversity maintained in coral reef taxa. So this is a paper that's cited in your book if you want the citation for this. But yeah, it was a group of researchers studying invertebrates on coral reefs, and specifically these encrusting kind of invertebrates that that grow over another taxon. They included things like corals and algae and all sorts of things in that study. But yeah, they ended up looking at all these pairwise interactions where they were seeing all these species and figuring out which other species were around it. And they could tell which species was winning in competition because in this case, competition for space in coral reef taxa results in one species kind of growing over the other. And so the one that's winning is the one that's doing the growing, and the one that's losing is getting grown over. And so yeah, they looked at pairwise interaction. So when species A is growing next to species B, which wins? When B is growing next to C, when C is next to A, and all this stuff. And they ended up finding intransitive competition where there was no one dominant species. There was always a species that the other, each species was limited by another species in a pairwise fashion at some point. So there was no overall dominant species. There was always someone that you were susceptible to losing to in this case. Okay, so that's it for some of those ideas about networks of interactions. The next thing that I want to talk about are some of the characteristics of communities. So people who are community ecologists, what are the kinds of things that they're doing? Certainly studying interactions, studying food webs and those interaction webs, that's a common thing to do. Another thing to do is to kind of summarize communities and compare across communities by looking at things like species diversity. So yeah, let's talk about some of the measurements basically that you can take about communities and how ecologists use these measurements. All right, so first of all, we have the species composition. This is basically just a list of the species present in a community, and pretty much most community ecologists are doing this. They go out to a place and they find all the species and identify them, and they talk about species composition. Yeah, that's just the members of a community. From the species composition data, you can get other kinds of measurements of communities as well. Specifically, diversity. That's a big one in community ecology, is comparing diversity of different communities. And a lot of ecologists are just fascinated by diversity. We see all these humongous communities of many different species, and we kind of want to explain why are there so many species, and what controls the number of species in an area. And so yeah, we're interested in species diversity, and that's a measure of the variation in species in a community. So how many species there are, and how represented each species is. And so yeah, there's two components here of species diversity that I just kind of mentioned. Species richness is the number of species in a community, and species evenness is the commonness or rareness of the species in a community. And that'll be a little bit more clear once we talk about richness and evenness with an example. But yeah, these are two different aspects of species diversity that people are interested in measuring. So yeah, let's look at an example here. We've got two different communities of fungi here, community A and community B. And I'm just showing you the fruiting structures there of the fungi, the little mushrooms. And yeah, just eyeballing this, you would probably say that community B is more diverse than community A. However, if you count the number of species, you can see that it's the same in both communities. There's 4 species, the yellow one, the orange one, the brown one, and the purple one. The difference here comes from species evenness. And so community B is going to be more even than community A. And so species evenness has to do with like whether the community is dominated by just 1 or 2 common species, or whether the species have more even abundances contributing to diversity. So yeah, community A, it doesn't look very diverse because it's dominated by that 1 yellow species, and the other species are much more rare. While community B looks more diverse because the abundances of each species is much more even, and so that species evenness. All right, so whenever community ecologists are going out and measuring diversity in an area, it's always going to depend on sampling, and so it's pretty much impossible to count every species that that occurs in a community. And the way that ecologists kind of deal with that challenge is by creating something called a species accumulation curve. And what they do is they take many samples from a community, and then from those samples, they kind of add up how many cumulative species they have found. And so here I'm showing you one of those graphs. It's got number of samples on the x-axis here and number of species found on the y-axis. It's important to note that this number of species found is cumulative, so it's never going to decrease. You can only add more species by sampling more, and that's kind of how these species accumulation curves work. And when you do these species accumulation curves, you get a graph that looks like this, where at first you're finding lots of new things with each sample that you take from the community. Eventually, it starts to slow down. You're basically getting closer and closer to finding all the species in that community. And so you start to level off. And so you would predict that eventually diversity would plateau at an asymptote. And that asymptote is where you actually predict the actual number of species for the community is. So yeah, that's a species accumulation curve. And yeah, we can kind of use those species accumulation curve to determine whether our sampling of a community has been thorough enough to find the species richness. I should denote that the capital letter S is often used to denote species richness. And so yeah, here I'm showing just some data from marine systems with echinoderms, fishes, and mollusks from 3 different places. And basically what you can see here is that for the green line and the pink line here, the fishes and the mollusks, it looks like there hasn't been enough sampling yet to see an asymptote. So you're still getting tons of new species with each new sample. So this is sampling years in this case, but yeah, we haven't plateaued yet at all. And so it's really hard to estimate number of species when you haven't plateaued at all. You're still in that early part of the graph where it's kind of linearly increasing. However, for the echinoderms, it does kind of look like we've plateaued. And so we would estimate maybe, I don't know, 480 or so species of echinoderms there in that system based on this sampling effort. Okay, so that species accumulation curves, and yeah, it's important to note that measures of species diversity are sensitive to how much you've actually looked for species in a community, and it can be really hard to actually estimate the total number of species. All right. Another thing that we do with species diversity is we try to compare communities. Like we say, this community is more diverse than this community, just like we did with the images of the fungi before. And it can be useful in many cases to kind of combine ideas of species richness and species evenness in a single measure. And that is often done with something called a diversity index. A really common one is the Shannon Diversity Index, which is denoted with the letter H, capital H. And yeah, it's going to depend on both the species richness and the species evenness. So species richness is denoted with an S here. And yeah, we're summing across all the species here in this formula for Shannon diversity. And it's also going to depend on the proportional abundance of each species, which is this PI term of this equation here. So PI is a proportion of individuals that belong to species I. Sorry for the typo there. And so yeah, the formula for Shannon Diversity Index, we've got H equals the sum of all species proportional abundances times the natural log of those proportional abundances. And so I'll do an example of that. Everything is taken, everything is inversed here with this negative because when you take the natural log of a proportion, it becomes negative. So we make it positive again with this negative right there. And yeah, H is going to vary between about 0 and 4 with natural ecosystems. It's pretty rare to get things that are as low as 0 or things that are high as 4. Yeah, most of it, it's going to be between like 1 and 3, I would say. But yeah, this can be a way to compare communities, looking at both richness and evenness at the same time with a single number. And so it's kind of convenient to do that. So we can do that that exact calculation here with these fungi in community A and community B, as I mentioned. So here I'm showing you the kind of a table here that helps you calculate the Shannon Diversity Index for these communities. So yeah, we've got the species, and each species is a different row. We've got the number of individuals of each species, so there's 17 yellow ones and one of each of orange, brown, and purple here. You do the proportional abundance by saying, okay, 17 divided by the total number of species in the community. So it would be 17 divided by 20 in this case. We get a proportional abundance of 0.85 or 85% for the yellow species, and then 0.05 for the other three species. We say we can substitute in the natural log of that proportional abundance times that proportional abundance and take the inverse of it in this column here, add those up together, and we get our Shannon diversity here, 0.5875 for the Shannon Diversity Index of Community A. If we do the same thing, same calculation for Community B, we get a Shannon Diversity Index of 1.38. And so yeah, you can see that even though they have the same number of species, Community B has a higher Shannon Diversity Index as a result of that difference in evenness. So yeah, these diversity indices just provide a convenient way of comparing communities and showing which community might be more diverse, including measurements of species richness and species evenness. Okay. Another way of kind of summarizing communities and how even the species are within a community is by making something called a rank abundance curve. And so in this kind of curve, you basically, you have data showing the abundance of each species in the community, and you just kind of graph that, like you make a histogram basically, where each species is along the x-axis, and they're ranked in according to their abundance, with the most abundant one being rank 1 here, and then we're going down in abundance as we go to the right. And yeah, we graph the proportional abundance on the y-axis. And so yeah, we can use these curves to look at the whole community at once as a more kind of holistic measure of species diversity and species evenness as well. So diversity would be like the length of the line. How many species there are is like how many data points there are along the x-axis. And species evenness would reflect in the kind of pattern that we see across species in terms of their abundance. So if we've got an even community, we expect a relatively shallow line here. If we've got an uneven community, we expect a few species, the most abundant species, to be much more abundant than the rarer species. So in this case, this is the same fungus diagrams from before. We've got community A and community B. And you can see community A, it was dominated by that one yellow fungus, and so that's what its rank abundance curve looks like. Community B had a really even distribution of all 4 species, and so that's what its rank abundance curve looks like. But yeah, this is another way of looking at diversity and evenness of communities, is by making these rank abundance curves. One thing that we see with these rank abundance curves is almost always communities are dominated by a few common species, and there are other species in the community that are much more rare, and they tend to be numerous. There tends to be lots of rare species and a few very common species, and that's kind of shown here. This is samples from a pond looking at beetles in water beetles in a pond, and yeah, you can see that there's lots. Some species there's many individuals, and other species there's few individuals. And yeah, you almost always get this kind of pattern where there's few common species and many rare species. This is a pattern that has been studied in a lot of detail by ecologists for many years. One of the fundamental patterns I would say in communities is this this species abundance distribution that I'm showing you here, and explaining why it's so right skewed. So why are there so many rare species? Why are there often just a few common species? There's a bunch of different explanations for this. Some of them are ecological, some of them are evolutionary. Um, if you're interested in this topic, there's tons of research, so you could just search species abundance distributions and figure out some of the hypotheses for this pattern. I'll say that this is a really general pattern that a lot of people have worked on, and especially rarity. So here are some quotes from Stephen Hubble, another famous ecologist. He's actually famous for coming up with the idea of the neutral distribution or neutral explanations of biodiversity, which we'll talk about. Kind of controversial figure. But yeah, here's some quotes from him. He says, "Commonness and especially rarity have long fascinated ecologists, and species abundance is of central theoretical and practical importance in conservation biology. In particular, understanding the causes and consequences of rarity is a problem of profound significance because most species are uncommon to rare, and rare species are generally at greater risk to extinction." So yeah, kind of explaining why most species are rare, that's a fundamental thing in community ecology. And as I mentioned, there's lots of theory to explain these patterns. Here I'm showing a bunch of different models and data that has been used to support those models. So yeah, here's a broken stick model with birds in a deciduous forest, following that model really closely. A log normal model with plants in deciduous forests, following that pretty closely, and then geometric series model with subalpine forest plants, following that closely. So yeah, different models are supported by different data sets, but it's really difficult to infer mechanisms from these kinds of patterns. If you think about it, we're not really taking into consideration anything about the identity of species and how they're interacting with each other when we're looking at these kinds of patterns. It's just numbers. It's just like there's this many of this species, this many of this species. And so it's really hard to kind of explain what's going on just from these patterns. And so yeah, there's basically been tons of work to try and figure out what's going on here, what's the mechanism behind these patterns, but it's really difficult to actually figure out what's going on. And yeah, different models are supported by different data sets. All right, so let's take a break and take a Menti quiz. So I need to stop sharing this. Any questions before we take this Menti quiz? I'll open up the chat so I can see it. All right, looks like not. So let's start with the quiz. Okay, 678841 is the code for this. All right. Looks like the membership here in this quiz is kind of stabilized, so let's go ahead and get started. What is another name for rock, paper, scissors competitive interactions? Very good. That's intransitive competition. I don't know why it started with that question. Let me actually go back because I think that was the last question. Okay, so let's start it now. Sorry, that was like the end of the quiz. All right, competing species with similar carrying capacities are more likely to coexist than species with dissimilar carrying capacities. Is this true or false? All right, this one is true. If you remember, after our discussion of the Lotka-Volterra competition model, we talked about the kinds of things that promote coexistence, and we had the stabilizing mechanism of the intraspecific competition being stronger than interspecific competition, resulting in those competition coefficients being less than 1. The other force was the equalizing forces, which is their carrying capacities are more similar to each other. And so, yeah, that's kind of a counterintuitive outcome of this model, is that species with similar carrying capacities are more likely to coexist than species with dissimilar carrying capacities. All right. Looks like Rob took it. All right, next question. Most species and communities are abundant. Yeah, this is false. We get a few abundant species, and then most species are rare. Okay. Next question. Pioneer species are expected to dominate during what? Sorry, this is like material that we haven't covered yet. So apparently this quiz is like in the wrong place in my PowerPoint presentation. But maybe you already read and you know it. Yeah, you do. So yeah, pioneer species are in the early stages of primary succession, probably evident just by the name of them. We'll talk about succession and community change in just a minute. All right, this quiz is all over the place. Let's see what's coming up next. Yeah, the next one is the one that you've already answered. And so, Tiger is the winner. Congratulations, Tiger. Okay, yeah, sorry about that. Let's go back to talking about communities. Share screen, PowerPoint. Okay. All right, and then the last little bit of chapter 16 talks about species that play a particularly important role in communities. So far we've kind of just summarized communities by saying the number of species. We talked a little bit about species composition as just like the list of species that occurs in a place. But there are some situations where certain species just play a particularly important role in the ecosystem. And so let's talk about some of those species now. They're known as keystone, foundation stone, and engineered species. The first two terms are kind of an analogy relating the importance of species to kind of engineering of these archways. So we've got a keystone as this stone in the top of an arch that's important for structurally stabilizing the entire archway, and the foundation stones would be these ones at the bottom. But yeah, let's just talk about these terms and what they mean. So a keystone species is a species that affects the rest of the community disproportionately relative to its abundance or biomass. So this is a species that might not necessarily be common in an ecosystem, but it's doing something that's really important for maintaining the ecosystem in a particular state. A really famous example of a keystone species is the starfish Piesaster, which lives in rocky intertidal places across the world. They were studied famously by Robert Payne in Western North America. But yeah, so here we've got some data from Robert Payne showing how Pisaster, that starfish, is a keystone species for maintaining diversity in this rocky intertidal system that he was studying. And so yeah, Pisaster is a starfish that preys on other invertebrates in this rocky intertidal ecosystem. So it's all these arrows here are feeding relationships. You can see the starfish is eating gooseneck barnacles, limpets, these snails, acorn barnacles, and chitons. And yeah, so there's lots of diversity of these invertebrates in this rocky intertidal system, and the starfish is kind of eating lots of them. Like it can eat a bunch of different things. And it turns out that if any of these kind of encrusting invertebrates that the starfish is eating, if any of them is becoming really abundant, the starfish kind of controls that variation in population size. So basically, if something's really abundant, there's more of a chance of the starfish eating it. And so the starfish kind of controls any one population of these other things from going to crazy abundances and dominating the community. And so here is number of species present on the y-axis and year on the x-axis, with an experiment where Robert Payne was just kind of, he blocked off areas of this intertidal system, and his control areas, he just observed what was happening naturally with starfish predation. And in his experimental plots, anytime he saw a starfish, he would pick it up and throw it away. So he was basically preventing the starfish from interfering with all of these other invertebrates in the rocky intertidal. And yeah, it turns out that when Pisaster is present, then you maintain a fairly high diversity of species, between 15 and 20 species of all of these other things, the barnacles and limpets and all that. However, when without Pisaster, when he threw away the starfish, preventing them from eating the most abundant species, it caused diversity to really drop. And so this is likely a result of competition. So there were probably competitive interactions among all of these encrusting invertebrates in the bottom here that result in a loss of diversity. So one species outcompeting another. And so yeah, without the starfish kind of controlling the population size of good competitors, you get extinctions happening. And so you go down to between 0 and 5 species without the starfish. And so yeah, even though the starfish wasn't really numerically dominant or particularly abundant or representing a large amount of biomass in these systems, it had a big effect on the diversity of the system, where when it's present, there's a lot more diversity than when it's absent. So yeah, that's a keystone species with this starfish, maintaining diversity of these invertebrates in the rocky intertidal. And yeah, the keystone is referring to this small stone at the top that's kind of maintaining the structural stability of the whole arch itself. All right. Similar to that, we've got the foundation stone species. These are species of great effect to the community, but also contribute a lot to the energy flow and are usually kind of a numerical or biomass dominating type species. And so these are forming the foundation of the arch in the archway analogy. And you can see these foundation stones are bigger, so that's saying a species that's really important to a community that's also abundant in that community or representing lots of the biomass. And an example of that would be kelp in a kelp forest ecosystem. So yeah, kelp forests also in rocky marine places support a huge variety of species. There's all these fish and invertebrates that live within these kelp forest ecosystems. However, they're really relying on that kelp. If there's some sort of disturbance that comes through and wipes out the kelp, then you kind of lose all of that diversity. All these species disappear, and it's replaced with a different kind of ecosystem. And so yeah, the kelp are really important, a really important foundation species for these kelp forest ecosystems. Um, they're really important for maintaining all the rest of the food web, but they're also dominant in terms of their abundance. So you can see that the kelp is really common and it's really abundant and representing lots of the biomass and energy flow in the ecosystem. Okay, last, we have engineer species. These are species that basically modify the environment and create entire habitats. They change a habitat enough to convert it from one type to another. Classic example of that is the American beaver. Um, I'm sure you're aware that beavers make these dams where they convert a flowing stream into a more still water lake kind of ecosystem. Often shallow with a bunch of different kinds of species that live in it. So yeah, you've got a different set of species that live in a stream than live in one of these beaver ponds or lakes. And so yeah, the ponds that are created by these beavers wouldn't exist without the beaver. And so that's an example of an engineer species that's kind of changing or creating an entire habitat. Okay, so that's it for kind of the intro for community ecology. The next thing that we'll talk about is community dynamics. How do communities change over time? And this is coming from chapter 17 in the textbook. All right, so let's talk about change in communities. Just a quote here from Heraclitus: no man ever steps in the same river twice, for it's not the same river and he's not the same man. So basically, that's just saying that everything changes. Here's just an example of a time lapse of a river with satellite imagery showing how the river is changing. This is physical changes, but obviously there's going to be biological changes and everything as well. But yeah, communities change over time, and there's a bunch of different agents of this change. So yeah, you can have disturbance. That's the biggest one. So this disturbance is an abiotic factor that kills or destroys some individuals of the community, in some cases wiping out the entire community completely. But yeah, this creates opportunities for other individuals to grow and reproduce. And so disturbance is one big thing that changes communities. Another thing is stress. So stress is an abiotic factor that reduces growth of some individuals without necessarily wiping them out like a disturbance does. And this is another way that you can get opportunities for other species or individuals to come in. And finally, you can have biotic interactions causing change in communities over time as well, including predation, competition, mutualism, all the things that we've talked about. And these biotic interactions affect the growth rate of the species that are in a community. And that's also a way that you can get new opportunities in a community, or fewer opportunities in the case of things like invasive species. And yeah, when species are moving around, changing the biotic interactions within a community, it can cause really rapid and extensive changes. All right, so let's take a look first at disturbance and talk about what happens when a community or part of a community is wiped out by something that's kind of killing members of that species or that community. As a note, this can happen as a result of human activity, in which case it's called an anthropogenic disturbance, or disturbances can be caused by natural processes as well. And so we'll talk about some examples of each of those. So yeah, here is examples of types of disturbances that are natural and anthropogenic. I should say that there's a lot of variation in how extreme a disturbance is. And one thing that's particularly important is whether the soil in a terrestrial community is still intact or not after a disturbance takes place. The soil is very important for the growth of the plants that form the base of the food web in terrestrial communities. And so yeah, a disturbance is particularly extreme if it gets rid of the soil that has developed in that community. So yeah, we've got types of disturbance, natural and anthropogenic, and initial conditions sort of after the disturbance as being with soil or without soil. And so yeah, here's just some examples. We've got a hurricane representing a natural disturbance where the soil still persists. Similar to that, we've got an anthropogenic situation with soil still persisting, and that would be like logging or lumbering, cutting down the trees in a forest. You can also have more extreme disturbances that get rid of the soil. So this would be like a lava flow in a natural kind of setting, or a strip mine in an anthropogenic kind of disturbance. Okay, so let's talk about what's going to happen after a community gets wiped out by one of these disturbances. So the process of, so basically a community is going to redevelop there, or change as a result of that disturbance. There's gonna be a sequence of changes that happens after that, and that sequence of change is called succession. So yeah, this is a natural sequence of communities that follows after you get a disturbance in a community. When you have primary succession, that's a situation where there's no life after the disturbance. After the disturbance, it kind of wipes everything out, and in order for new life to arrive, it has to come from somewhere else. Secondary succession, on the other hand, there's a disturbance, but it's less extreme, and there's life present at the beginning. For example, if the soil is still there, you've got all the soil microbes and fungi, and as well as often a seed bank of plants that basically start the regrowth process of the community. Okay, so here I'm showing a classic sequence showing how you can go from a bare rock. So primary succession starts with just bare rock, and then over time you develop into a forest kind of ecosystem. So this would be a sequence of changes in a community that takes place in a system like a biome, where we would get a kind of deciduous, temperate deciduous forest, oak hickory forest, expected to occur there based on the climate. All right, so we've had some disturbance that results in the death of all the species. We're left with just bare rock. So maybe this was like an earthquake or a lava flow or something. The first set of species that arrive in this sequence of primary succession are called pioneer species. These are species that are capable of dealing with the stresses of very little in the way of nutrients and that kind of thing. And so yeah, the first species are called pioneer species. And often with bare rock, we get colonization by lichens. Lichens are these symbiotic associations between sac fungi and algae. So they're kind of photosynthetic, but they're able to use nutrients in really harsh environments like bare rock and tree bark and that kind of thing. So yeah, we get lichens coming in. They're really, really slowly over long periods of time breaking down that rock and using it as nutrients as they're growing. As that rock gets broken down and some of these lichens die and introduce organic matter into the top layer of the rock there, we get soil formation. And soil formation is necessary for most plants to grow. And so after we get soil, we can get plants coming in. They typically, the first plants to arrive in this pioneer succession situation are small annual plants that are really good at dispersal. So they've got some sort of seed dispersal mechanisms that allow them to end up in one of these openings. Over time, we get grasses and perennial plants establishing, and then over many, many years, you get other kinds of species coming in, species that maybe disperse not quite as often, but are more reliant on deeper soils and that kind of thing. So we get, yeah, grasses, shrubs, and shade intolerant trees such as pine trees at this intermediate stage of succession. And finally, we get a climax community, which is basically a community that's really sensitive to disturbance. And if it's been a very long time of undisturbed kind of situation, then we get this climax community with shade-tolerant trees such as oaks and hickories in this temperate example here. All right, and so you might be wondering, why is there this sequence of change in the community? Why do we get situations where a community is going to change following this specific sequence of events? Why don't you get trees growing right away if that bare rock was in a biome that should support a forest? And the reason for that is that the forest species, the trees and everything, are reliant on soil. So they need that organic matter in the soil and everything in order to grow. And so it might be hundreds of years for enough soil to be around to support a forest in this kind of primary succession situation. So this whole process of communities kind of replacing each other in this sequence of events, at least with primary succession, relies on something called facilitation, where the actions of one set of species is actually benefiting other sets of species as well. And so that would be like the lichens by really slowly breaking down that rock and introducing organic matter into the top layers of this ecosystem here, kind of setting the stage for soil formation and allowing other soil dependent species to establish. So that's called facilitation. The lichens are facilitating these other things, these other plants, mostly for facilitating their presence in the ecosystem. And maybe they're actually doing that. It's like an unintentional thing for most species, because it often results in a community that results in them getting wiped out. So, for example, lichens become less common as we go through this sequence of succession. Okay. So yeah, that's primary succession, going from bare rock to a climax community. You can also get what's called secondary succession. So this is when the disturbance comes through, but there's still life after the disturbance. And often with secondary succession, it's really the soil that's the most important thing. If the soil's still there, then basically we can go through this sequence of succession a lot faster. So yeah, here is another example of succession, but this is secondary succession in abandoned fields in North Carolina. And so yeah, we've got when a field, an agricultural field, is abandoned, we've got this sequence of communities that kind of takes over in that field. So first, in the field, we get annual forbs kind of taking over. So whatever seeds are around in the landscape that can disperse into this abandoned field, and they germinate and they take over. And so yeah, the beginning stages, you get a community dominated by annual forbs. And typically these are things, again, that have seed dispersal where they can get to these places quickly. Next stage, we get dominated by perennial grasses and forbs. So these are things that took a little longer to get there, but are better at competing for things like soil nutrients and light and that kind of thing. And so they outcompete some of those early annuals. Next, we get a community dominated by loblolly pine trees in North Carolina. This is a really abundant tree that has sort of wind dispersed seeds that can get pretty far, and also really fast growth rates. And so early on in the succession, they can grow really tall and shade out other species of trees, for example. But over time, you get a kind of closed canopy forest with lots of shade, and pines can't really germinate. The seeds don't really germinate if there's not a lot of sun available to them, whereas other species can. So things like oaks and maples and that kind of thing, their seeds germinate in the shade. And so over time, you get the pines being replaced by hardwood species like oaks and maples and hickories and that kind of thing. That they're just slowly growing in the understory with the little bit of sunlight that's reaching reaching them through the pine trees in the top of the canopy. And as the pine trees die, they're not replaced with more pine trees because the seedlings of the pines are not growing in this shaded forest. And so yeah, over time you get the pines being replaced by deciduous broadleaf trees, which are better competitors for light. Okay, so yeah, that's succession examples with primary succession and secondary succession. I should say that the climax community, the endpoint of succession, is mostly dependent on the biome. As we mentioned, when we were talking about biomes, the biomes have specific climates that kind of favor a different, a specific kind of community developing. Different kinds of disturbances can actually set off a different sequence of successional changes, and so that's kind of shown here. We've got this orange disturbance versus this red disturbance. So yeah, if you've got a disturbance that's like soil acidification, that might be different than something like logging the trees or something like that. And so you can get different different successional sequences dependent on the specific type of disturbance that you had. However, the theory is that within a given biome, you would eventually reach this climax community. If there's no more disturbance, the climate is sort of favoring the specific set of species that's in the climax community. All right, so do we actually see these climax communities? Is that a common sort of thing to find as we're going out in nature? Are most communities climax communities, or are they somewhere along the sequence of succession? I would say we're mostly mid-successional with our communities that we actually see in nature. Disturbance is a really common force. It's pretty rare to get a community that's like completely disturbance-free for very long periods of time, such that you get the actual climax community developing. Just as an example of that, this is a map showing places with forests in the US and Canada. And so everything that isn't white, everything that's colorful here is forested. And the color is indicating the stand age of the forest. How old is that forest in years? And you can see that the warmer colors are young forest. The cooler colors are older forest. So these cooler colors are more where you get the climax communities developing. And yeah, you can see over most of the US and Canada, the forests in this case are mid-successional. So they're often pretty young, and a lot of that is human activity. A lot of it is logging for lumber and paper and that kind of thing, resulting in a kind of mid-successional forest community instead of the climax community in those places. And so yeah, it's pretty uncommon to have climax community. Another word for this in terms of forest is old growth forest, which is something that we mentioned. I think I mentioned it when I was talking about barred owls in a few lectures ago. But anyway, yeah, so old growth forest is pretty rare. Most of our communities are going to be kind of mid-succession, somewhere along that successional gradient. Okay, so just a little bit more about the climax communities. As I mentioned, old growth forest is another name for the climax community if you're in a forested biome. And these tend to be pretty different than the mid-successional forests. So characteristics of old growth forests include things like standing dead trees called snags, lots of dead trunks and logs on the ground and everything. They tend to have high diversity with species not found in other communities. So often there are species that are kind of dependent on these undisturbed climax communities, and one of those is the barred owl, or sorry, the spotted owl, that's what I meant to say. So northern spotted owl is an endangered species in Western North America. And yeah, so these old growth forests are really important for diversity, especially of these really sensitive species like spotted owls and things like salamanders and things that rely on fallen trees and that kind of thing. So there's lots of rare species that are found only in these climax communities. All right, so just thinking about this, these examples of succession that we've talked about so far, and thinking about life history, the things that we talked about in chapter 7, what kind of life history traits do you think early successional species have versus late successional species? So yeah, I'll open this up to, what are they called? Breakout rooms. So let's do 3 rooms. So yeah, you should be getting your invitation to join one of these breakout rooms in just a second. But yeah, the question is, what kind of life history traits do you think early successional species have versus late successional species have? It looks like no one else joined you in your breakout rooms, so I wanted just to.
Yeah, no one else did.
So yeah, do you have any ideas about this life history question?
So I was thinking primary may have more like adaptations to, live in these newer environments. Would that be maybe one of them? While secondary, maybe not as much.
Right. Yeah. So the thing that I was kind of going for is mostly aspects of like growth rate, population growth rates, and that kind of thing, as well as dispersal mechanisms. So what do you think the early successional species would have, for example, with regards to population growth and dispersal?
Probably they would grow much faster to fill the community, the newer community, than the
Right.
secondary.
Yeah.
And also disperse within the community more, I think.
Yeah. Well, that could be. That could be, and there often are actually species that have 2 different dispersal strategies, one that they stay close and one where they go far. But yeah, a lot of the early successional species can go really far actually, and that's kind of how they get to these disturbed places is even though there might be little patches of openings in the environment where a disturbance has taken place, they're able to really efficiently get to those places because, or not, maybe not efficiently, but effectively by producing lots of seeds, for example, that can disperse really far.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, cool. I'll go back to the main session and close. All right, I think I'm unmuted now. Okay, looks like everyone left the breakout rooms. So yeah, type your answers in the chat. What kinds of life history traits do you expect early successional species to have? We'll start with those. So like the pioneer species and the plants that arrive early early in the successional sequence. All right, no takers. All right, being able to live in harsh environments, that's certainly one for sure. So there was this thing that we've talked about already with regards to life history called Grimes Triangle, which was like showing adaptations of plants for 3 different aspects of the life history. One was like being really competitive. One was kind of a ruderal strategy that's sort of relying on getting to disturbed areas, and then the other one was a stress tolerant strategy. And so yeah, the competitive species we expect to see late in succession, and the other 2 maybe early in succession. All right, someone says early plants have high reproduction rates. They're small, high mortality, large amounts of offspring, I'm assuming. Yeah, so that's the kind of thing that you expect to see with early successional species. So let's go back to PowerPoint. So yeah, here is that Grimes triangle, as I mentioned. We've got the competitive species in the top of this triangle. We've got the weedy ruderal species here with increasing disturbance. So the disturbance specialists would be the ruderal ones. And then we've got the stress tolerance at the really stressful environments kind of axis. So in terms of especially secondary succession, we're mostly along this axis of the Grimes triangle right here. Between competitive species and ruderal species. So yeah, if there's lots of disturbance or disturbance has happened really recently, we expect this ruderal strategy, which these weedy plants that are, they basically reproduce a lot, they grow really quickly, and they make lots of seeds that can disperse pretty far. And so yeah, we expect these life history traits, so this would be like the R-selected versus K-selected species. We expect the early succession species to be the more R-selected species, and the late succession species to be more more the K-selected species. So the strong competitors that have less dispersal if there's a trade-off between dispersal ability and competitive ability. All right, and here, so yeah, there's often this this trade-off between your ability to invest in dispersal versus your ability to invest in being a good competitor. And so yeah, here's an example, going back to that example with Old Fields in North Carolina, looking at this trade-off between competition and colonization. Early on in succession, we had things like grasses and forbs. And these have like not a lot of investment in competition with other species. Instead, they invest a lot in having high reproductive rates, taking advantage of lots of sunlight and everything when it's available, and making lots of seeds. And the seeds are often wind dispersed and can go really far. So they wind up in some of these places after they get disturbed pretty well. Next, we get shrubs coming in, shrubs that might also, so the shrubs are investing a little more in competition for light. They have a woody tissue that allows them to grow a little taller than things like grasses and forbs. But the shrubs tend to still have pretty good dispersal mechanism. So here I'm showing a shrub Baccharis that has wind dispersed seeds, much like the grass seeds. Then I mentioned we've got pine trees. That's the next sort of, pine forest is kind of the next kind of community that you get in the successional sequence of Oldfield succession in North Carolina. And yeah, here's showing the seeds of the pines, the loblolly pines that are wind dispersed, and they can get pretty far themselves. Not as far as these feathery like seeds, but farther than say an acorn or something. And so yeah, the pine trees are next. They're investing a lot more into competition for light, so they grow really tall and shade out other species. And finally, we've got the climax community species, the oaks and the maples that they tend to have seeds that are not dispersing as far. So like these acorns here are falling pretty close to the parent tree. However, those seeds have a lot of nutrients available to them, so that seedlings can grow in the shade basically. And so yeah, this species in the sort of climax community invest more into competing with other species. So they're good at germinating in low light conditions and growing in low light conditions, and eventually replacing the things like the pines, which are not able to germinate in those low light forest kind of conditions. Okay, so with the last couple minutes of class, I want to talk about some of the patterns of change that we see in communities. So succession isn't always just like this march from disturbed to climax. You can often get the maintenance of communities in various stages of succession with repeated disturbance and with changes in the disturbance regime. You can basically go like forward and backward along this scale from early succession to late succession with a change in the disturbance regime. So there are many natural ecosystems and man-made or human-altered ecosystems that are maintained by disturbance. And examples of that include things like tallgrass prairies in the central U.S. and south central Canada. In these communities, if there's no disturbance, they would often undergo succession to be a more forested kind of ecosystem with shrubs and trees. However, periodic fires come through and they wipe out the good competitors, the trees and shrubs, and you're left again with the forbs and the grasses. And so fire is basically an intrinsic part of many grasslands, and fire is important for maintaining this kind of ecosystem. And that's the same thing in central Texas. So a lot of Texas used to be prairie, used to be much more dominated by forbs and grasses. And by putting out fires like humans tend to do, we're tending to get other kinds of ecosystems developing now, things like the juniper woodlands that we see in the Edwards Plateau these days. So yeah, in some cases, disturbance is important for maintaining communities in a kind of mid-successional state. Here's another example with conifer forests in the Northern Rockies. In this case, we kind of get a successional sequence happening, but it's sort of reset every now and then by periodic disturbances. So rather than being maintained as a specific habitat, these conifer forests kind of go through a cycle that depends on more periodic disturbances. So like slightly rarer than we got in the prairies, but common enough that we get this sequence happening repeatedly in a cycle. So yeah, you get conifer forests that are developing in the Northern Rockies. You get fire coming through that kind of kills off a lot of the adult trees, and you're left with this post-fire vegetation which has a lot of forbs as well as seedlings of the trees that germinate. A lot of these tree species actually germinate in response to fire. So the seeds are kind of protected by these resinous cones and that kind of thing, and they rely on fire for germination. And so yeah, here's some examples of forests where these kinds of crown fires that kill trees are common. And so yeah, you can see these patches of unburnt forest and patches of burnt forest, and you can kind of cycle between these two different kinds of communities. The kind of community that I'm showing here, where the bison is in kind of a savanna type ecosystem with forbs and grasses with some conifers mixed in, as a result of periodic fires. And yeah, here's just showing some of this regeneration work with lodgepole pine forest. If you want more information on this, I would recommend talking to our TA, Carolyn. She's studying this for her PhD, so she could say a lot more about this kind of fire succession than I could. Do you want to say anything now, Carolyn? I see that you turned your video on.
No, just letting people know I'm here. It's 11:15. I don't want to hold anyone up.
Okay, sweet. Thanks for letting me know. Yeah, but yeah, Carolyn's much more an expert than I am on this kind of succession, especially fire succession in response to fire. All right, so we'll end it there. I'll finish up talking about succession and do some meta community and biogeography stuff next class. Let's see, are there any questions before we break for the weekend? Okay, so then actually our next class is the exam. Sorry, so yeah, I'll be sending an email. I already sent an email actually about the exam, but yeah, I'll be in contact with the exam while you're taking the exam. So it'll be during the normal class time, and I'll be available over email if you have any questions. I'm assuming that everyone's going to have their notes open and everything, so that's fine. And yeah, just let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you next Thursday then. And that's when I'll finish up this community change and stuff. All right. Have a good one. Bye.